Welcome to Superchargers. I'm Daniel Thomas. Let's go. G'day, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I sure do appreciate it. My guest on this episode is Jude Holland. Jude is a coach and therapist who primarily helps women with abuse recovery and narcissistic relationships. She's written the book Us versus Me, Me, Me. She's over in the UK, and during our conversation, offered some awesome practical insights. Enjoy this one. What led you to dealing with this type of work and helping people heal from toxic relationships?
I've been a therapist now for 25 years, and worked within sexual assault units and within a hospital, which was predominantly with women and families. And I also then went to work predominantly working with men within a sexual assault unit. But during that time, um, I um, I lost my mum. And when I lost my mum, a couple of days after that, I then discovered that my partner was also cheating, and I threw my partner out. And from that, through that bereavement process, I then started to use self-defeating behaviors. So I was kind of drinking too much to kind of, regulate my emotions, which, ultimately took me towards a dating site where I then met what became my abuser over the next 6 years.
Yeah, wow. I can relate to that, just in terms of experiencing loss and the kind of trying to self-regulate through alcohol, and then sort of attracting toxicity in relationships. Yeah, so that sort of, it sounds like that sort of pulled the rug out from under you.
Yes, very much so. And, going into that relationship, nobody expects to be in a relationship that is abusive. And at the beginning of that relationship, there wasn't any issues there. But now looking back, I can see the red flags that, that were there. Um, Part of that being that, the rushing in that relationship where I kind of moved in with the abuser within 6 months. So I actually gave up my home. So in lots of ways, right at the very beginning, I kind of played into that abusive cycle ultimately, and kind of isolated myself from family and friends, and kind of gave up my home.
So when you came out of that, um, it's it's very courageous that you were not only able to heal yourself, but then you were like, I want to help others with what. So, I mean, you had this firsthand experience. Then did you just have this sort of drive that you could help other people through your own experience?
I think it's actually from lots of different areas. Like I said, I've been trained as a therapist for 25 years, so lots of the kind of things that I needed to move forward. So, being in that abusive relationship reduced my self-esteem. There was lots of kind of negative self-talk. So, looking towards helping others, I was trained, and I've kind of done further training since in connection to, looking after yourself, having that compassionate voice, mindfulness, kind of really looking after myself every day. And I wanted to pass those skills on to other people.
You've done some work in EMDR.
That's right.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because I've also done a load of therapy and different types of self work in so many different ways. And actually, when I was a lot younger, EMDR was a very helpful thing that I did, a helpful, call it a tool. And
Hmm.
I didn't know what it was at the time, and I thought that, when the counselor suggested it, I thought that it might bring up all this sort of really kind of bigger stuff, but it actually just brought up one very kind of small but significant thing that had happened to me as a kid, and I worked through it. So I found it really helpful. So for people who
Hmm.
might not know what EMDR is, can you tell us
Hmm.
a bit about that?
Okay. So eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So if we think about, it was originally, the originator of EMDR was Francine Shapiro, and she was having a bad day. And ultimately, she was walking through the park and watching the leaves blow in the park. And what she realized was by watching the leaves blow, she was actually feeling better. And that was kind of the beginning of EMDR. That was the beginning of that process.
So it was the movement of the
It was the
leaves.
the, the
The
movement in that, yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's amazing. For me, it just like I had to sort of let go of kind of expectate, because as I was doing it, I was like, this is weird, but I had to let go of the judgment of what I was kind of
Yeah.
seeing visually. And once I let go of it and just went with it, it just helped me relive something that needed to be sort of brought out.
Hmm.
So I
For,
just
for
think
me, for
it's just a
me,
very
part of
effective tool, I think.
it's very effective. And for me, using EMDR as a therapist, and obviously since we've had COVID, using EMDR has changed slightly as well. So in EMDR, you see lots of people using the kind of electrical equipment in connection to EMDR. When I trained, you would actually tap and use yourself as the tool in EMDR. And part of my process in using it with clients is that I also ask them, after they've had EMDR, that they download an EMDR app in between, that they keep a diary of anything that may come up in between, such as flashbacks or any nightmares, so that that can then be reprocessed in the next session. So ultimately, if we think about EMDR and we think about the brain, any trauma that we've experienced along the way, if we think of that becoming stuck in the brain. And what EMDR does is allow the brain to reprocess that information that has become stuck. So, yes, we might think about specific traumas, but if we think about anxiety, depression, generally most people have more than one episode over their lifetime. So it means that we can use EMDR with those things as well. And we do that timeline and work across that timeline with the episodes and the incidents that they may have had.
Yeah, it's really practical. There's nothing kind of wacky about it. That's what was
No.
cool about it. And like you say, that when something's stuck, and it just needs to come through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so it's a very practical thing, which is cool. You've also spoken about the uh emotional the 8 steps to emotional resilience. Can you
That's
talk a
right.
little bit about that?
Yeah, the 8 steps to emotional resilience are looking at the areas that I feel become um, a real issue when you're coming out of an abusive relationship. So, being in an abusive relationship, there's a real sense of not being able to have a voice, not being able to say no, that real sense of judgment, not being able to have a future ultimately and have that clarity of mind. And thinking about building those supportive relationships for you in the future. So all the things the relationship destroys in you, your self-esteem, having that compassionate voice. The 8 steps to emotional resilience are the steps within the areas that are then destroyed within that relationship. So it's very much about goal setting, fear of judgment, reducing those fears, the feelings of isolation, um, looking at your vision for the future, and that you have a choice, and looking at your future like a blank piece of paper, and you can create what you want to create looking forward, using some of the tools that I kind of offer within the 8-week program that I deliver.
Interesting. I know from some call them toxic relationships. I often realized sometimes there was a bit of denial there. People around me who cared for me were saying, I don't think this person's sort of good for you. I'm talking different relationships, but people
Yes,
were like,
yes.
this person's not necessarily good for you, or
Mhm,
caring for your sort of well-being and interest. And I was just in a state where I was refusing to hear that.
mhm, mhm.
So do you think it's important how do you know, I guess it's an awareness thing. When you're caught in the storm, it's very
Yes.
hard to be aware of whether it's good for you or not.
Yes. And I would say, if I use my own experience there, Daniel, what I would say for me was that part of what happens in a relationship is that you don't necessarily speak out, that coercive control within that relationship. And generally, from my experience, it was financial abuse that was the beginning in my relationship, where we'd been together for 6 months, but then my abuser didn't work then for the next 6 years. So in that, I then felt responsible in connection to that financial aspect in the relationship. Other aspects within the relationship: emotional, physical, mental abuse. And I think there's something around, also dependent on our upbringing, what we see as normal in a relationship as well. So if we've seen arguments in relationship, then that's might feel quite normal in our relationship. But also, let's say we've had emotional abuse, mental abuse, but there hasn't been physical abuse. So for me, the change in the relationship and the wanting to leave was at the point when it became physical.
Yeah, it's in different forms. The
Yeah.
abuse, it's quite a gray area in terms of the different forms they take. And yeah, like you say, if you've experienced certain patterns when you're young, it might feel in a strange way safe
Hmm.
to repeat those things that you know and try and repeat that. But yeah, it takes a lot of courage to break out. So I
Hmm.
think, how much do you think awareness plays a part?
I think awareness plays a great deal, really, but ultimately it comes down to shame. That the abuser has, you have no self esteem in that place. That you are very submissive at that point, and it takes courage to kind of speak out, maybe to your next door neighbor, to your friend. Are they going to judge me? From my perspective, I was a professional working in this area. What are people going to think if I say that this is what's happening in my relationship? So not only, that judgment of yourself, but judgment from other people. So the courage to kind of speak out. And I would say, for me, I spoke out to my dad's next door neighbor. I spoke out to my sister, and I also spoke out to an ex-policewoman who I was working with at the time. But it was at a point where that relationship was already at a critical point.
It's awesome in a way that you're double qualified. I'm not saying that experience is awesome, but the fact that you
Mm,
have had this first-hand experience and you're fully trained and qualified. Because often, I'm always like, how could somebody teach you basketball if you haven't thrown a basketball? Just as a random example. I mean,
yeah,
I think some people in your line of work have the training, and that's fantastic. But I'm sort of like, you have this double thing where you experienced it firsthand and you have these
yes,
training and tools, which is pretty
yeah.
cool.
Exactly. And when someone says to you, um, I feel like I don't want to go home. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And I can sit there and I think I know exactly what that feels like. Yes, we can have empathy for someone without experiencing that. But I think coming from a place where you have experienced, physical abuse, and how difficult it is to actually leave that relationship. And generally it can take people 3, 4, maybe 5, 6 times before they leave that abusive relationship, because it's about rebuilding your life. Financially, have you got a job? Have you got somewhere to live? Other things that, so for me, for instance, I didn't have a home. I had 6 dogs at the time, which made it difficult to move out, So all of those things really were kind of used against me in that relationship.
So when somebody's self-esteem is shattered,
Mhm.
what would be a good first step in terms of rebuilding that?
Thinking about writing those thoughts down. So if we're still in this relationship and we feel that we can't reach out and we can't speak to someone at that point, then at least kind of writing something down so you're allowing yourself to verbalize in some ways those emotions and those thoughts that are going on for you. So we're kind of moving more towards a self-compassion and a caring for you.
Yeah, writing is just so awesome in terms of
Mm-hmm.
all you need is a pen and paper, and it doesn't have to be for any particular outcome, but just
Mm-hmm.
trying to put it in context and trying
Mm-hmm.
to make sense of it on paper. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's really
Mm-hmm.
very
And
helpful.
then also, I think what can be really useful, both from a safety perspective, but also in a way of getting rid of those emotions, might be to look to maybe burn that or destroy it in some
Mm.
way, so it can't be seen and it's no longer part of you as well.
Yeah, exactly. Just throw it away,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't. Yeah, it can be in any way, shape, or form. It's just about getting it in context. It's easy to beat ourselves up over these. Um, when you do come to that realization, and you've rebuilt your confidence and you're in a far better place, it's easy for one to beat themselves up about
Mm-hmm.
ever getting into that relationship. How do you suggest, does that come down to the self-talk again?
Part of it is the self-talk, but I think it's also about how are we looking after ourselves? Are we having, do we do positive affirmations every day? What are we doing to look after ourselves moving forward? And like I said, no one goes into a relationship thinking that it's going to be abusive, and we kind of stay in that relationship for lots of different reasons, and it's different for everyone, but we're in love with the person that we met, not the person that they become. But I think we hold on to, that person that we originally met, that person we loved, hoping that they're going to be that person again. And we get moments in that kind of love bombing where they're saying it's never going to happen again. I love you, and then in the next breath, if you leave, no, who's going to want you? So we're swinging from one to the other all of the time. And we're in this place where we're questioning our thoughts, what's going on here? There's a real sense of confusion.
I like this notion of sort of get yourself right and the rest falls into place.
Yes.
And sometimes I was like, oh, I wish I knew that when I was young. If I'd just been patient and really worked on getting myself right. But the thing is, life doesn't work that way. Like
No.
as you're trying to get yourself right, you have relationships. It's
Yes.
human nature. You get into relationships. So
Uh-huh.
it's not like, it's just it's an ongoing journey, and we learn from our mistakes and
Mm-hmm.
the challenges, and people and relationships, they hold mirrors up to us. I think,
Yes.
they're reflecting things to us all the time.
And I think the important thing, you talked there, Daniel, about doing the work on ourselves. And I think in relationships, if we don't do that work on ourselves, then those patterns repeat in later relationships. So the more work we can do on ourselves, the less chance that is to happen ultimately.
And we often repeat, like you said earlier, over and over. Like
Yes.
we don't just
Yeah.
repeat once. We just tend to, until that kind of, till we step off that wheel,
Hmm.
or bring an awareness to those patterns. It's harder to
Hmm.
bring about change.
Yeah. And I think, for most people, there are critical moments in a relationship that make you decide that this isn't okay or I'm going to leave. But ultimately, domestic violence, domestic abuse doesn't discriminate, man, woman, race, it doesn't discriminate. Whatever your profession is,
What are some of the biggest commonalities you've found with people coming out of these relationships?
Okay. I think there's lots of different things, patterns around what happened in the relationship, lots of arguments, um, about self-esteem, feeling shame, feeling judgment from others. Um, but also, once you leave, I think that there is a sense of relief initially, and then people think it's okay. But then we have other things that we then have to address. So thinking about going into new relationships, can I trust myself in this relationship? Can I trust what I'm picking up from this person? You know, the fact that they may be having trauma response from that relationship. They may be having flashbacks. They may be having nightmares. You know, going out, and initially your home might not feel safe. You may not feel safe when you go out, having that hypervigilance, you know, looking for that person in the street. So though people may think, you know, I've left, that's the end of that relationship, actually the response from that can continue afterwards. And it's having an awareness that that can happen, so it also doesn't take you by surprise.
It also takes a great amount of courage once the heart has been scarred.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a huge amount of courage to risk um, opening that again.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And yeah, a huge amount of courage. And I want to say, for me, I spent over 12 months on my own, working on myself, no intentions of any relationship. And really, actually, it also made me question and put more boundaries in the close relationships, you know, with female friends and family that I had as well. So it made me look at my relationships as a whole, not just kind of intimate relationships.
I reckon it's so important to take that time to heal. Often people, you know, if there's kind of struggle with loneliness, it's easy to just go from one to the other. But unless we take that time to really evaluate, and like you say, it's kind of cool that that showed you relationships across the board. You know, sort of drew a
Mhm.
line in the sand for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what happens, part of what you were saying there about being on your own, I think what happens is when we're in a relationship with someone, our focus ultimately is on the other person and not on ourselves. And then when we are on our own, what and we spend a lot of time on our own, what happens is we then go inward. And then we start to think about those negative things about ourselves, which we wouldn't necessarily do when we're in relationship with someone else. So those things that that other person may have said to us and we now kind of believe about ourselves feels bigger. So it's about doing that work on yourself, you know, that negative self-talk, that, you know, I am a good person, I do deserve to be loved. And maybe that is about having a positive affirmation every day, whatever your positive affirmation is. So we're reinforcing the positive rather than that negative.
We've touched on the journaling, and you've just mentioned the positive affirmations. Is there a
Mhm.
challenge that you would recommend that anybody can try on a daily basis in terms of call it self work or relationship with self? Is there something that
Mhm.
springs to mind?
I think there's lots of different things that we can do. For me, I would ask someone, because ultimately when you come out of an abusive relationship, you're kind of stuck in the now, is what I would say. And what I want people to create is that clarity of thought, okay? And also that vision of what your future would look like. So for me, what I did at that point, I created a vision board for the next 12 months across the board, looking at my relationships, looking at my job, um, to give me that clarity of what I wanted my future to look like, you know. And if we're thinking about our positive self talk to ourselves every day, then that is going to have a real impact on what our vision board looks like and where we are in 12 months' time. So if I said to you, you know, if I said to anyone really, think about that negative voice that you have in your head. Would you speak to a child in that tone of voice? And most people would say no. And why wouldn't you speak to a child in that tone of voice? Because probably it would be hurtful to them, or they, you know, they may be harmed in some way. But it's okay to talk to you in that way.
Mm.
So I suppose I would put that out there for people to think about. What does that voice sound like in your head? So that's one thing I would offer you. Something else I would offer, which sounds a little bit more bizarre, if you like, is if you think of your internal you, how you're thinking at the moment, how you're feeling at the moment, and you put an external copy of that outside of you, like a hologram, and you looked at that, what would it look like? Is that how you want to look? Or do you want to change what you see?
Yeah, no, that's cool. Like objectively step away and objectively look at it. Um, yeah, no, that's very cool. Your book, Us versus Me. How was that writing process for you? Was that a cathartic process as well?
Um, I think in lots of ways, Us versus Me was like a 10-point plan. These are the things that I want you to look at in a relationship that could say to you that you're in a relationship with someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. And for me, I wouldn't say that my abuser had narcissistic personality disorder because he was never assessed. But I would say that he had traits of narcissistic personality. So in our relationship, even at the point of him strangling me, he never said he was sorry. You know, he had this real sense of grandiose about him, you know. So there were lots of kind of things or traits that he portrayed that are in the kind of book in connection to a kind of 10-point plan of what to look for.
So it's not as black and white as someone's a
No.
narcissist. They can have behavior traits as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. And,
it's
and and for me, what I would say there, Daniel, is I don't think that we can say that someone has narcissistic personality disorder without them having had diagnosis. And that's where I'm coming from. He hadn't been to anyone, you know, to say that he had any issues, because I had the issues. And that's where I kind of come from. You know, without a diagnosis, we can't say that there is that diagnosis.
Are there any pieces of art, call it books, films, music, that have particularly impacted you, or that you have found to be a kind of accurate perspective on this topic? It can be
I
anything.
think that Okay, I think there are lots of things out there that we can kind of see. And the reason I don't kind of say, go and look at this book or read this book is because you have to be ready to do that. Two, I think there's a lot of noise out there that doesn't necessarily relatively fit for you. But a book that has always stayed around for me was a book called A Woman of Substance, which was ultimately about a woman whose life was difficult throughout her life. And for me, that book kind of stood out. So I think there's something about not necessarily a particular book, but maybe something that may stand out for you that might not be around abuse.
Mm. Yeah. There's a lot of noise. Um, but being up near Manchester, is music important to you personally?
Music is important to me, and ultimately, I was head of department in a music college in Manchester. So I worked at BIM Manchester for 4 years, and I find this really strange that you've asked me this question. And part of the reason why I went down that road and I was employed. One was because I wanted to change direction for a period of time and work in education rather than specific trauma related services. So that was my first reason. But two, I used to be a Cher impersonator.
Oh,
So
wow. That's awesome. That's so cool.
I used to be a Cher impersonator. So, of course, when I mentioned this in interview, they kind of knew, okay, you're going to know about what it's like to perform, how anxious you may feel beforehand. So, all the things that I could connect with students in connection to being there and offering my support ultimately, both from a therapeutic perspective, but also as a performer.
See, again, that's the double thing. You had the performance background and you had the training, so you could bring both, which is really cool. Yeah, I just ask about music because I just find music
Mhm.
such a important thing in the healing process, and people connect with it in different ways. And the fact that
Mm-hmm.
you were a performer, and then it sounds like you went through this tumultuous relationship and you had to rebuild that confidence. But that's fascinating.
I'm going to give you one of the songs that kind of helped me.
Mm,
Okay. So, as I've just said, I was a Cher impersonator. And the song that stayed with me for a long period of time and still stays with me is the song Strong Enough.
mm.
So that was one of the ones for me that kind of stood out. Strong Enough.
Yeah, very strong lyrics in that. I heard it in a movie yesterday, actually, and I get flashbacks from that song for that
Okay.
time and
Okay.
place. It had some power to it. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, pretty cool. Where can people find you and the book?
Where can they find me in the book? Both of the books that I've wrote, you can find me on Amazon. So quite easy to kind of find me. So I am under Jude Holland as well. So I haven't changed my name because obviously I want my voice to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
There you go, guys. Honest ratings for the show on Apple are appreciated. If you have a guest suggestion, please feel free to reach out on my website at danielthomas.co. I'm also on social media at Mr. Dan Thomas. Catch you on the next episode.